December 16, 1944, before dawn settles over the Ardennes forest, the snow absorbs every sound. Pines stand frozen, their branches heavy with ice. Beneath them, German infantry move forward in silence, boots crunching softly, rifles held close to their chests. The offensive has begun. For weeks, secrecy and speed have carried them this far. Surprise is their greatest weapon. Across the frozen ridges, American positions are thin. Many of the men are new. Some have never heard a shell fired in anger. Artillery crews work by touch more than sight, hands stiff inside wool gloves, breath hanging in the air like smoke. The maps tell them they are about to be overrun. Then the first rounds are fired, not toward the ground, but into the air above the advancing troops. The explosions come differently than expected. Not buried in snow, not absorbed by earth. They bloom overhead, sudden, precise, devastating. German formations stall, then break, men diving for cover that no longer exists. Something has changed, and they do not yet understand what it is. To understand how this moment became possible, the story must step back, to a war already thought decided, and a gamble Germany believed could still reverse it. By the winter of 1944, the Second World War in Europe appeared to be entering its final act. The Allied landings in Normandy 6 months earlier had broken the Atlantic Wall. Paris had been liberated in August. By September, American, British, and Canadian forces were pressing toward Germany's western border. Newspapers spoke openly of victory. Many soldiers believed the war might be over by Christmas. But beneath that confidence lay strain. The Allied advance had moved faster than its supply lines. Fuel shortages slowed armored divisions. Infantry units were stretched thin along a front that ran hundreds of miles from the North Sea to Switzerland. In some sectors, exhausted divisions were rotated out and replaced by green troops still learning the rhythms of the front. Commanders believed the Germans no longer had the strength to mount a major counteroffensive. Adolf Hitler believed otherwise. Germany in late 1944 was bleeding. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Cities burned nightly under Allied bombers. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army was massing for an advance that would soon reach the Oder River, yet Hitler remained convinced that one decisive blow in the West could change everything. He envisioned a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest, the same region used in 1940, splitting Allied lines, capturing Antwerp, and forcing a negotiated peace. The plan was named Operation Wachte am Rhein. It was audacious to the point of recklessness. German units were pulled from quiet sectors, rebuilt with hastily trained replacements, and concentrated in secrecy. Fuel was hoarded at the expense of other fronts. Orders emphasized speed, confusion, and shock. If the offensive stalled, Germany had no reserves left to recover. The Ardennes was chosen precisely because it seemed unlikely. Dense forests, narrow roads, steep ravines. American commanders viewed it as unsuitable for large-scale armor operations in winter. That assumption created an opening. On December 16, 1944, under the cover of fog and snow, more than 200,000 German troops surged forward. Artillery barrages shattered quiet American positions. Communications were cut. Entire units were encircled before they understood what was happening. The German advance created a deep bulge in the Allied line, the feature that would give the battle its name. For several days, momentum favored Germany. American infantry fell back, sometimes in disarray, sometimes fighting stubborn, delaying actions at crossroads and villages. Bastogne, a small Belgian town critical for road networks, became a focal point. German commanders assumed it would fall quickly. Instead, it held surrounded, undersupplied, and under constant attack. Air power, the Allies' great advantage, was neutralized by weather. Low clouds grounded aircraft. Snow concealed movement. For German troops advancing through the forest, it felt like the war had turned back in their favor. But while German planners had accounted for tanks, aircraft, and manpower, there was one element of American strength they underestimated, and one technology they did not fully understand. The United States Army had spent years refining its artillery doctrine. American commanders believed artillery was not merely a support arm, but a decisive battlefield weapon. Radios, centralized fire control, and flexible targeting allowed American guns to respond faster and more accurately than their German counterparts. Even in retreat, American artillery continued to inflict heavy casualties. What Germany did not know was that some of those guns were now firing a new kind of ammunition, one whose effects would only become apparent when the fighting reached its most desperate moments. And as German columns pushed deeper into the Ardennes, that moment was approaching fast. Long before the Ardennes offensive began, American engineers were fighting a different kind of war, one waged in laboratories, testing grounds, and remote proving fields far from the front. It was a war against physics, reliability, and time. At its center was a problem as old as artillery itself: how to make a shell detonate at exactly the right moment. Traditional artillery rounds relied on impact or preset time fuses. Impact fuses buried shells in earth or snow before exploding, wasting much of their lethal force. Time fuses, set before firing, were notoriously unreliable. Variations in temperature, barrel wear, and propellant charge meant shells often detonated too early or too late. Against troops in the open, especially in forests or on snow-covered ground, their effectiveness dropped sharply. In the late 1930s, American scientists proposed a radical solution. Instead of timing the explosion, they would let the shell decide for itself. The concept became known as the VT fuse variable time, though its true nature was more sophisticated. Inside the nose of the shell was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. As the shell flew through the air, it emitted a continuous signal. When that signal reflected off the ground or nearby objects and returned at a certain strength, the fuse triggered the detonation. The shell exploded at an optimal height above the target, scattering fragments downward in a lethal cone. It was an engineering nightmare. The fuse had to survive acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. Its vacuum tubes had to function while spinning thousands of times per minute. It had to work in rain, snow, cold, and heat. And above all, it had to be reliable, because a failure could detonate the shell prematurely, destroying the gun crew that fired it. By 1942, after thousands of failed tests, the device began to work. The United States treated the VT fuse as one of the war's most closely guarded secrets. There was deep fear that if one failed to explode and fell into enemy hands, entirely to naval anti-aircraft fire over the ocean, where unexploded fuses would sink beyond recovery. Even then, its impact was immediate. Allied naval gunners reported dramatic increases in aircraft kills. Japanese pilots quickly learned to fear the invisible bursts in the air that shredded planes before they reached their targets. Still, the Army hesitated. Using VT fuses over land carried the risk of capture. If Germany acquired the technology, it could be turned against Allied troops. For years, that risk outweighed the potential benefit. The fuse remained locked away, authorized only under strict conditions. The Ardennes changed that calculation. As German forces broke through American lines in December 1944, the situation became critical. Infantry units were surrounded. Artillery was often the only means of defense. Snow and forest limited visibility, making traditional fire less effective. German infantry advanced in dispersed formations, using terrain for cover, reducing the impact of ground-burst shells. American commanders faced a choice: continue fighting with known limitations, or deploy a weapon that could decisively alter the battlefield, at the risk of losing its secret. They chose to deploy it. Orders went out quietly. VT fuse shells were issued to artillery units with strict instructions. They were to be fired only when necessary. Any duds were to be destroyed immediately. The Germans were never to know exactly why their casualties were increasing, only that something had changed. As the battle intensified around Bastogne and along the Elsenburn Ridge, American guns began firing these new rounds into the winter sky. For the soldiers beneath them, the effect would be sudden, terrifying, and impossible to ignore. Because the Battle of the Bulge was no longer just a contest of numbers or maneuver, it was about to become a contest of perspectives, human, tactical, technological, all colliding at once. For the American infantry, the new explosions were first felt as relief. Men who had spent days digging foxholes into frozen ground now heard detonations cracking above them, rather than burying themselves uselessly in snow. Shrapnel came down on the enemy instead of disappearing into the earth. Survivors later recalled the sound, sharper, closer, almost like canvas tearing in the air. Artillery crews did not always know why the rounds worked better. Many were simply told the shells were special. What they saw were German attacks breaking apart before reaching friendly lines. Units that had been on the verge of withdrawal suddenly held their positions. Morale, brittle only days earlier, steadied. For German infantry, the experience was profoundly different. Veterans accustomed to artillery learned to read incoming fire, the whistle, the impact, the pause. In the Ardennes, that pattern vanished. Shells detonated without warning. There was no crater to dive into, no timing to anticipate. Men were hit while running, while prone, while sheltering beneath trees that now became fragmentation traps. Forest cover, once a defense, turned lethal. From a tactical perspective, the effect was immediate and measurable. Airburst explosions multiplied casualty rates, particularly against infantry advancing in open or wooded terrain. Artillery observers reported significantly higher effectiveness with fewer rounds fired. Defensive fires became barriers rather than harassment. German assault tactics relied on infiltration and movement under cover. VT-fused shells disrupted that approach. Units attempting to regroup or press forward were repeatedly broken apart. Attacks slowed. Commanders lost control of formations under sudden, invisible fire. German reports from the battle described confusion more than fear at first. Officers assumed American gunners had improved accuracy or that new tactics were being used. Few suspected a technological breakthrough, but patterns emerged. Wherever American artillery concentrations were strongest, attacks failed disproportionately. Losses mounted without clear explanation. By late December, German units began avoiding certain sectors altogether, not because of tanks or aircraft, but because of artillery that no longer behaved as expected. And as these angles converged, human endurance, battlefield tactics, enemy confusion, the weapon's true significance became clearer, even as its nature remained hidden. Because behind the bursts in the winter air was a technological decision that reshaped leadership choices on both sides. At the heart of the VT fuse was a simple idea executed with extraordinary precision. The fuse emitted a continuous radio signal as the shell traveled toward its target. When the signal reflected back from the ground or nearby objects with sufficient strength, it triggered the detonator. The result was an explosion at roughly 30 to 70 feet above ground, the optimal height to maximize fragmentation spread against exposed troops. Unlike time fuses, the VT fuse adjusted automatically. Snow depth, slope, or vegetation no longer mattered. The shell responded to the environment in real time. For German infantry advancing through forests, the effect was devastating. Tree canopies and branches caused early reflections, triggering bursts that sprayed fragments downward and outward, turning wooded areas into killing zones. American after-action reports noted casualty rates 2 to 3 times higher than those achieved with conventional shells in similar conditions. Artillery units could neutralize attacks with fewer rounds, conserving ammunition during a battle defined by supply shortages. For American commanders, the decision to authorize VT fuses on land was not taken lightly. General Omar Bradley and other senior officers understood the risks. But as German pressure mounted and units faced encirclement, the calculus shifted. Winning the battle outweighed preserving the secret. Orders emphasized discretion. VT fuses were to be used primarily in defensive fire. If a shell failed to detonate, patrols were sent to destroy it. The Germans were not to be allowed physical proof of what was hitting them. This restraint reflects how seriously Allied leadership viewed the technology. They were not chasing spectacle. They were buying time for weather to clear, for air power to return, and for reserves to arrive. For German soldiers, the psychological impact soon eclipsed the physical. Artillery had always been terrifying, but it had rules. Those rules were now gone. Men spoke of shells that seemed to hunt them. Attacks stalled as troops hesitated to move through open ground or forests that offered no protection. German commanders noted declining aggressiveness in units exposed to heavy American artillery fire. Assaults became cautious, fragmented, and delayed, fatal flaws in an offensive that depended on speed. By early January, the Ardennes battlefield had changed. What began as a surprise, German breakthrough had become a grinding fight against an enemy whose artillery now dominated space above the ground itself. And all of it was building toward a moment where pressure, weather, and technology would converge, the point at which the German offensive would finally lose its momentum. By late December 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had reached its most critical phase. German forces had pushed deep into the Ardennes, but the offensive was slowing. Fuel shortages were becoming acute. Roads were clogged with wrecked vehicles and stalled columns. Resistance at key junctions, places like Saint-Vith and Bastogne, refused to collapse. Bastogne, in particular, had become a symbol of defiance. Surrounded on all sides, the American garrison held the town against repeated German assaults. Snow covered the fields. Visibility was limited to a few hundred yards. German infantry advanced cautiously, using the terrain to mask their movements. Artillery and armor were brought forward to crush the pocket. What they encountered instead was something entirely different. American artillery units positioned around Bastogne had been authorized to use VT-fused ammunition extensively. Forward observers, often operating from church steeples or hastily dug positions, called in fire as German troops formed up for attacks. The response was immediate. Shells burst above the advancing infantry, not sporadically, but with terrifying consistency. German assault waves disintegrated before reaching American lines. Men were hit while moving between tree lines while lying prone. While attempting to reorganize after earlier barrages, officers struggled to maintain control as communications broke down under fire. The forest itself betrayed them, triggering airbursts that turned cover into shrapnel. At Elsenborn Ridge, a similar pattern unfolded. German units attempting to break through American defenses found themselves pinned and then destroyed by concentrated artillery fire. VT fuses allowed American gunners to blanket assembly areas, choke points, and advancing formations with lethal precision. Counterattacks stalled almost as soon as they began. The weather, which had favored Germany earlier, now worked against them. Low clouds still limited air support, but artillery did not need clear skies. American guns fired day and night, guided by sound, flash, and radio reports. German units could not mass without being detected. They could not advance without being punished. Reports from German field commanders became increasingly desperate. Losses were heavy, progress was minimal. The surprise that had fueled the offensive was gone, replaced by a grinding attrition they could not sustain. And as December turned to January, the moment arrived when the German command realized the truth. The offensive had not merely slowed. It was being broken, piece by piece, by a weapon they had never planned for. The final collapse would come soon. On January 1, 1945, Germany made one last attempt to regain the initiative. Operation Bodenplatte sent the remaining strength of the Luftwaffe against Allied airfields in a desperate bid to cripple air power. The attack failed catastrophically. Experienced pilots were lost in numbers Germany could not replace. Whatever hope remained of air superiority vanished in a single morning. On the ground, the situation was even worse. American artillery dominance had reached a point of inevitability. German units no longer advanced in mass. Instead, they probed cautiously, seeking gaps that no longer existed. Each movement drew fire, each pause invited destruction. VT-fused shells burst with relentless regularity, denying the Germans the ability to regroup or exploit terrain. At Bastogne, German attacks dwindled and then ceased. Relief columns pushed in as weather cleared and Allied aircraft returned to the skies. Supplies dropped by parachute. Wounded were evacuated. The siege was effectively over. Along the entire front, the German offensive began to retract. Fuel shortages forced the abandonment of tanks. Vehicles were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. Infantry units retreated through the same forests they had once advanced through in confidence. Now those forests echoed with American artillery fire. German after-action reports later acknowledged the devastating effectiveness of American artillery during the battle. While they often attributed losses to improved coordination or volume of fire, Some commanders noted the unusual nature of the bursts, explosions above ground that inflicted disproportionate casualties. They had encountered something new, but too late to counter it. By mid-January, Allied forces launched coordinated counterattacks, pushing the Germans back toward their starting positions. The Bulge was erased. What remained were tens of thousands of casualties, shattered divisions, and a final confirmation that Germany no longer possessed the strength to seize the initiative in the West. The Battle of the Bulge had failed, and while many factors contributed, logistics, weather, air power, resistance at key towns, one element had quietly reshaped the battlefield at its most critical moments. With the guns finally falling silent, the consequences of that decision would begin to reveal themselves. When the fighting subsided in late January 1945, the Ardennes lay devastated. Forests were shredded. Villages reduced to rubble. Roads were lined with burned-out vehicles and hastily marked graves. The Battle of the Bulge had become the largest and bloodiest engagement ever fought by the United States Army. American casualties numbered over 75,000, killed, wounded, missing, or captured. German losses were even higher, estimated between 80,000 and 100,000 men. For Germany, these were losses it could not replace. Entire divisions were rendered combat ineffective. Tanks abandoned for lack of fuel never returned to service. Veteran soldiers were gone, replaced by hastily trained conscripts with little chance of survival. In reviewing the battle, Allied commanders emphasized one factor repeatedly: artillery. American artillery units fired hundreds of thousands of rounds during the campaign. Despite difficult conditions, they maintained coordination, accuracy, and responsiveness. The integration of forward observers, radio communication, and centralized fire control allowed guns miles away to shape the battlefield in real time. VT-fused shells stood out in post-battle assessments. Reports credited them with dramatically increased lethality, particularly in defensive operations. Infantry units that might otherwise have been overrun were held intact. German attacks were broken before reaching American lines. In some sectors, casualty ratios heavily favored the defenders, despite numerical inferiority. German intelligence, reviewing the failure of the offensive, struggled to explain these outcomes. While air power and logistics were obvious factors, artillery losses appeared unusually high. Yet, without physical evidence of the VT fuse, the Germans never fully grasped the cause during the war itself. For American forces, the lesson was clear. Artillery had not merely supported the defense, it had defined it. And the decision to release a closely guarded technological advantage had paid off at the moment it mattered most. But the full implications of that decision would extend far beyond the frozen forests of Belgium. In the months following the Battle of the Bulge, the United States Army expanded the use of VT fuses across Europe. With the risk of capture diminishing as Allied forces advanced, restrictions eased. Artillery units began employing the fuses more freely, particularly against infantry concentrations, defensive positions, and retreating columns. The results were consistent. Operational research teams documented significant increases in artillery effectiveness. Fewer shells were required to achieve the same or greater effects. Airburst fire reduced the need for prolonged bombardments, allowing faster advances and conserving ammunition. Enemy troops found it increasingly difficult to dig in or hold ground under sustained fire. German forces, already weakened, had no counter. Developing an equivalent technology required time and industrial capacity they no longer possessed. Even had they fully understood the VT fuse earlier, it is unlikely they could have deployed a response before the war ended. Post-war German analyses acknowledged American artillery superiority as a decisive factor in late-war battles. While they often attributed this to doctrine and coordination, the underlying technological edge was undeniable. The VT fuse did not end the war by itself, but it accelerated Germany's defeat by stripping away one of the last advantages infantry could rely on: concealment. Beyond Europe, the implications were even broader. The proximity fuse became a standard component of post-war artillery and air defense systems. Its principles influenced missile guidance, radar development, and modern battlefield sensors. What began as a solution to a gunnery problem evolved into a foundation of electronic warfare. Yet during the Battle of the Bulge, none of this was visible to the men in the snow. They did not see circuits or radio waves. They saw only the results: attacks that failed, lines that held, and a battle that turned when it mattered most. With the fighting over, the war pressed on toward its conclusion. Germany would surrender less than 4 months later. But the memory of that winter remained, not just as a test of endurance, but as a moment when unseen technology quietly reshaped the fate of a battlefield. And in that quiet shift lies the deeper meaning of what happened in the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge is often remembered for its scale, the snow, the desperation, the suddenness of Germany's last gamble. It is remembered for frozen foxholes and isolated units holding crossroads against impossible odds. But beneath those images lies a quieter truth. Wars are not decided only by courage or numbers. They are shaped by moments when expectation collides with reality. Germany entered the Ardennes believing it understood American strength. It expected tanks, aircraft, and manpower. It planned for artillery that behaved as artillery always had. What it encountered instead was a battlefield where the air itself had become lethal, where concealment failed and movement invited destruction. The VT proximity fuse did not announce itself. It made no sound distinct from any other shell. It left no signature crater. Yet its presence was felt in every attack that stalled, every formation that broke apart before reaching its objective. It transformed artillery from an area weapon into a precision instrument of denial. For the soldiers who survived, the effect was simple. They held. For the offensive, the result was final. It failed. In the broader arc of history, this moment marked a turning point in how wars would be fought. Technology no longer merely extended the range of weapons, it began to alter the space between them and their targets. The future of warfare would increasingly be shaped by systems unseen, their influence measured not in spectacle but in outcome. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, Germany learned that lesson too late. The battle ended. The war continued, but the rules had changed.